She walked out after pay cut offer. We lost our biggest client. They say loyalty is a two-way street. What they don't tell you is that some people treat it like a one-way mirror. They can see through to your devotion, but you'll never see through to their betrayal. I learned that in a conference room on the 42nd floor, where the city stretched out like a promise that was about to break. The windows were floor to ceiling, the kind that made you feel like you were floating above the world, until you remembered you were still in a cage, just one with an expensive view. Manhattan spread below us like a circuit board. Glass towers and steel arteries carrying ambition through streets that never stopped moving. From up here, everything looked clean, orderly, the kind of lie that only works from a distance. My name is Sarah Chen, and I used to believe that excellence was its own reward, that if you worked hard enough, delivered consistently enough, made yourself indispensable enough, the company would recognize your value. That merit mattered more than politics. That results spoke louder than relationships, that you could earn respect one client at a time until it was undeniable. I was wrong about a lot of things. I was wrong about loyalty, about reciprocity, about the difference between being valued and being valuable. I was wrong about what indispensable really meant. Not that they couldn't replace you, but that they'd never paid enough attention to realize they should try to keep you. I was wrong about corporate family and team culture, and all the words they use to make you forget you're an expense line they're constantly trying to optimize. But I wasn't wrong about my worth. That's the one thing I got right, even if it took them trying to cut it by 20% for me to remember. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Thursday in March. Spring was trying to break through the city's gray exterior, but winter wasn't ready to let go yet. The morning had been overcast, that particular quality of light that makes everything look slightly unreal, like you're living inside a photograph that's been edited for mood. I'd been at Morrison & Blake for 7 years, senior account director, top biller 3 years running, the person clients asked for by name when they called the main line. 7 years. That's longer than most marriages last these days, longer than most people stay at any job in an industry built on lateral moves and strategic repositioning. I'd stayed because I believed in what I was building, because the work mattered, because I'd cultivated relationships that felt like architecture, carefully constructed over years of late nights and weekend calls and the kind of attention that made people feel seen rather than serviced. Thornhill Industries was my crown jewel, $18 million in annual billing, a manufacturing conglomerate that had grown from regional player to national presence under my strategic guidance. I'd restructured their entire marketing approach, repositioned their brand from industrial commodity to innovation leader, turned them from invisible to inevitable in their sector. Robert Thornhill, the CEO, trusted me. More than that, he respected me. He treated me like a partner in his company's success instead of a vendor to be managed down on price. In 7 years, we'd never missed a deadline, never lost a pitch, never delivered anything less than exceptional. That kind of track record should have meant something. That kind of consistency should have been currency in a world that claimed to value performance above all else. Should have been. The conference room had those floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind that cost extra in Manhattan real estate, but were worth it for the psychological impact. James Morrison sat at the head of the table, 58, silver hair that looked natural, but probably wasn't, suit that cost more than my monthly rent. Ermenegildo Zegna, probably. The kind of suit that whispered money without shouting it. Next to him, Patricia Blake, the numbers person, all sharp angles and sharper spreadsheets. Mid-40s, ambitious, the kind of woman who'd learned to succeed by being harder than the men who tried to dismiss her. I'd respected that once. And David Chen, the CFO, no relation despite the shared last name, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, pity maybe, or discomfort. The look of someone who knew what was coming and wished they could be anywhere else. The table between us was polished mahogany, reflecting the overhead lights like dark water. There were bottles of San Pellegrino, glasses, a leather portfolio at each seat. Everything Morrison & Blake did was staged, designed, calibrated for maximum professional impact. "Sarah," James said, gesturing to the chair across from him. His voice had that modulated quality of someone who'd learned to make commands sound like invitations. "Thanks for making time." Like I had a choice. Like this was a request instead of a summons. Like I didn't know that "thanks for making time" was executive code for "we're about to do something you won't like, and we're starting with courtesy to soften the blow." I sat. The leather chair was expensive, ergonomic, designed for comfort during long negotiations. Herman Miller, probably Aeron. It felt like an electric chair. "We wanted to discuss your compensation package," Patricia said, sliding a folder across the table toward me. Black leather portfolio, Morrison and Blake embossed in gold on the cover. Everything they did was branded, even the bad news, especially the bad news. Given the current economic climate and some restructuring we're implementing across the firm, I opened the folder. The paper inside was heavy stock, cream-colored, watermarked. They'd spent money on the presentation of my devaluation. Numbers jumped out at me. My current salary laid out in clean typography. My bonus structure detailed across multiple pages, my benefits package itemized with the precision of a forensic accountant. And then, on the next page, new numbers. 20% reduction in base salary. Elimination of performance bonuses. Increase in billable hour requirements from 1,800 to 2,200 annually. The city beyond the windows kept moving, traffic and commerce, and the mechanical rhythm of capitalism that doesn't care if you've given 7 years or 7 minutes. The sun broke through clouds briefly, catching glass towers across the street, making them glow like they'd been lit from within, beautiful and cold and utterly indifferent. "I don't understand," I said, keeping my voice level even though my pulse was accelerating, even though I could feel heat rising up my neck the way it did when I was trying very hard not to show anger. "My accounts are all performing above target. Thornhill just renewed for another 3 years. I brought in 2 new clients last quarter, Pemberton Medical and Verdi Sustainability, both substantial contracts. My retention rate is 98%. "And we appreciate that," James interrupted, his tone suggesting appreciation wasn't actually part of this conversation. "You've been a valuable member of the Morrison and Blake team, but the firm is facing pressure across all departments. The market is shifting, clients are demanding more for less, and we need to optimize our cost structure to remain competitive." Optimize, that word again. The corporate euphemism for taking more while giving less, for squeezing margins until something breaks, for treating people like expenses to be minimized rather than assets to be invested in. "This represents a significant cut to my total compensation," I said, doing the math in my head even as I spoke. "More than 20% when you factor in the lost bonus potential, closer to 30% in a good year. We understand it's a difficult adjustment," Patricia said, and her voice had that quality people use when they're pretending sympathy while delivering cruelty. Like a surgeon explaining that the amputation is necessary, so sorry about your leg. But it's necessary for the firm's long-term stability. Everyone is making sacrifices in the current environment. I looked at James's watch. Patek Philippe Nautilus, probably $40,000. The kind of watch that wasn't about telling time. It was about telling everyone you'd succeeded. Looked at Patricia's handbag on the credenza behind her, Hermes Birkin, easily 10,000, possibly more if it was one of the rare colors. Looked at the art on the walls, original pieces by artists whose names I recognized from gallery openings I couldn't afford to attend. A Rothko print, a Basquiat sketch, investments disguised as decoration. "Is everyone taking cuts?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Silence. The kind that answers questions without words. The kind that fills rooms and makes everyone uncomfortable, except the people who created it. "The partnership structure is different," David said finally, and at least he had the decency to look uncomfortable about it. "Partners have equity stakes that tie them to the firm's long-term success. This restructuring primarily affects senior management and below. Senior management and below, which meant everyone who actually did the work while partners collected the profits. Everyone who built the client relationships while partners collected the credit. Everyone who billed the hours while partners collected the margin." "What if I don't accept?" I asked. James leaned back in his chair. Herman Miller, executive model, probably $3,000 of ergonomic support for a man who'd never done a day of manual labor in his life. His fingers steepled in front of his face, a gesture I'd seen him use 100 times during client negotiations. It meant he was about to deliver what he considered to be the killing blow. "Then we'd need to reevaluate your position with the firm," he said. "These terms are non-negotiable, Sarah. The partners have made this decision based on extensive financial analysis and strategic planning. It's not personal, it's survival. Morrison and Blake has been around for 43 years. We didn't get here by being inflexible when market conditions change. Everything that starts with 'it's not personal' is about to get very personal." I thought about 7 years, about the pitch I'd prepared while sick with the flu, because Thornhill's timeline couldn't wait, because I'd believed that showing up mattered, that dedication meant something. About the vacation I'd canceled when Morrison and Blake needed someone to salvage a client relationship that a junior partner had destroyed through arrogance and inattention. About the weekends and evenings and early mornings when I'd chosen work over everything else, over dates and dinners and the possibility of a life that wasn't defined by billable hours, because I believed that excellence mattered, that loyalty was reciprocated, that making yourself invaluable meant you'd be valued. I thought about my apartment rent that required every dollar of my current salary, about my student loans from Columbia that barely budged despite years of aggressive payments, about the retirement account I'd finally started contributing to, meaningfully, trying to make up for the years when I'd been too junior to save, too focused on proving myself to think about a future beyond the next quarter. And I thought about Robert Thornhill, who'd told me last month over drinks at his club that I was the best account director he'd ever worked with in 30 years of business, that he stayed with Morrison and Blake because of me, not despite me, that if I ever left, he'd seriously reconsider the relationship. I laughed it off at the time, thought he was being generous, flattering, engaging in the kind of professional compliments that CEOs throw around when they're happy with your work. I didn't take it seriously because I couldn't imagine leaving Morrison and Blake. It was my identity, my reputation, the place where I'd proven myself against every skeptic who thought a first-generation immigrant's daughter couldn't compete with Ivy League pedigrees and old money connections. But sitting in that conference room with a portfolio full of numbers that told me I was worth less than I'd been yesterday, I started taking Robert Thornhill's words very seriously indeed. "I need time to consider this," I said, closing the folder with deliberate care, like I was handling something fragile instead of something that felt like a weapon disguised as a business document. "Of course," James said, ending the meeting with his body language the way executives do, making it clear that the discussion was over, whether or not you'd finished talking. "We'll need your decision by Monday, 5 p.m. We'd like to finalize the new compensation structures across the firm by end of week." 4 days. 4 days to decide if I was worth fighting for, or if I'd accept being devalued by the only metric that mattered to them: cost. 4 days to choose between security and self-respect, between the known and the terrifying blank space of possibility. I walked out of that conference room into afternoon light that felt wrong somehow, like the sun was shining on a different city than the one I'd woken up in. The hallway was generic executive floor, abstract art, muted carpet, the kind of deliberate blandness that was supposed to feel professional, but just felt soulless. My office was on the 38th floor, corner space I'd earned through years of performance that apparently didn't matter anymore. The view faced west, toward the Hudson River and the bridges that connected this island to other boroughs, other possibilities, other lives I'd never seriously considered until now. I sat at my desk and pulled up my compensation history. 7 years of data, each year documented with the meticulous record-keeping that Morrison and Blake required. Steady increases, bonuses that reflected the revenue I generated, recognition that seemed to prove the system worked. Last year alone, I'd billed $22 million across all my accounts. Morrison and Blake kept roughly 30% of that as profit after expenses, salary, overhead, the considerable cost of maintaining offices in Manhattan. $6.6 million in profit that I'd generated, and they wanted to cut my salary by $60,000 annually. The math didn't work unless you understood that the math wasn't really about money. It was about power, about reminding you that no matter how good you were still replaceable, still subordinate, still subject to decisions made in rooms you weren't invited to by people who saw you as a line item on a spreadsheet rather than a human being who'd sacrificed years of her life to make them wealthier. My phone buzzed. Against the desk, screen lighting up with a text from Robert Thornhill. "Quick question about Q2 strategy when you have a moment. Nothing urgent, but want to align on timing for the new product launch." I called him back immediately. His voice was warm when he answered, energetic in that way successful CEOs have when their businesses are thriving and they're excited about the future. "Sarah, good timing. I wanted to run something by you about the product launch. We're thinking June instead of July. Wondering if that changes the media buy strategy, whether we need to adjust the budget allocation." We talked for 30 minutes. He valued my opinion, trusted my judgment, treated me like a partner in his company's success, even though technically I was just a vendor, just another expense line on his budget. When he explained his concerns about market timing, he listened to my analysis without interrupting. When I suggested alternatives, he considered them seriously instead of defending his initial position. When we concluded, he thanked me genuinely, the way you thank someone who's made your life easier rather than just performed a service you're paying for. When we hung up, I sat staring at my computer screen, at the Thornhill file that represented 18 million reasons why I shouldn't be taking a pay cut. And something crystallized in my mind, sharp and clear as glass breaking, as ice cracking, as all the careful rationalizations I'd built over 7 years shattering at once. They thought I needed them more than they needed me. They thought my loyalty was so entrenched, my fear of change so powerful, that I'd accept whatever terms they offered because where else would I go? 7 years at one firm looked like dedication, or it looked like lack of options, depending on who was interpreting it. They thought I'd bought into the system so completely that I couldn't imagine existing outside it. They were wrong. I spent Thursday night updating my resume. Not the version you send to job boards when you're desperately unemployed, but the real version, the strategic pitch deck for myself. 7 years of results condensed into compelling narrative. Client retention rates that exceeded industry standards by 20 points. Revenue growth that most account directors spent entire careers trying to achieve. I documented everything with the same precision I used for client reports. The Thornhill relationship I'd built from scratch when they were a regional player. The crisis management that had saved 3 major accounts when product launches failed or market conditions shifted. The junior staff I'd mentored who'd become top performers and credited me with their development. Looking at it laid out on paper, on screen, in the cold light of my apartment at midnight, with the city glowing beyond my windows, I realized something I should have understood years ago. I wasn't valuable because of Morrison & Blake. Morrison & Blake was valuable because of people. Like me, the brand they'd built over 43 years was just a shell. The substance was the relationships, the expertise, the dedication of people who did the work while partners collected the profit. Friday morning, I called a headhunter, Marcus Webb, someone I'd met at industry conferences over the years, whose card had been sitting in my desk drawer for 2 years with a handwritten note on the back. When you're ready to explore options, I know people who'd be very interested. Sarah Chen, he said when he answered, and I could hear the smile in his voice, could hear him sitting up straighter in whatever office he worked from. I was wondering when you'd call. How did you know I would? Because talent like yours doesn't stay undervalued forever. Eventually, something pushes you to realize that loyalty only matters if it's mutual. What finally did it? I told him about the pay cut. About 7 years and $22 million in billing, and the meeting where they'd made it clear that excellence didn't matter as much as their profit margins, that my value was whatever they decided it was, rather than what the market would bear. Morrison & Blake, he said, and there was something knowing in his tone, something that suggested he'd had this conversation before, with other talented people who'd finally reached their breaking point. They're notorious for this. Great reputation externally, carefully cultivated brand, but internally they grind down their top performers until they burn out or leave. Then they act surprised when clients follow the people instead of staying with the firm. I have a non-compete clause, I said. 18 months prohibits me from working with any clients I serviced while employed there. Everyone does, but non-competes have limits, especially for client relationships you built personally over years. If clients choose to leave Morrison & Blake and hire you independently, that's their business decision, not client theft. You're not soliciting if they come to you. And even if Morrison & Blake tries to enforce the non-compete, courts look at reasonableness. 18 months is long, but not unconscionable. Geographic restrictions matter. Industry restrictions matter. The real question is whether Morrison & Blake wants the publicity of suing a former employee who left after they cut her compensation. He paused, and I could hear him typing, pulling up files or making notes, or whatever headhunters do when they're calculating how to position talent they want to place. "Are you thinking about leaving?" he asked. Was I? 24 hours ago, the answer would have been no, without hesitation. Morrison & Blake was my identity, my reputation, the place where I'd proven myself against every skeptic who thought I couldn't compete. Leaving meant starting over, meant uncertainty, meant admitting that loyalty and excellence hadn't been enough to protect me. But sitting in my apartment with my resume open on the screen, with 7 years of accomplishments staring back at me, I realized I'd already left. The moment James Morrison slid that folder across the table and told me I was worth 20% less than yesterday, something had broken that couldn't be repaired with apologies or counteroffers or promises of future consideration. "Yes," I said, "I'm thinking about leaving." "Good. I have 3 firms that would be very interested in talking to you. Top-tier agencies, competitors set to Morrison & Blake, but younger, hungrier, better cultures. And Sarah? Yeah? Don't accept that pay cut. The moment you do, you're telling them they can devalue you whenever it's convenient. Your worth doesn't decrease just because they decide not to recognize it. The market will pay what you're worth. You just have to trust that enough to test it." We talked for another 20 minutes. By the time I hung up, I had meetings scheduled with 3 competing firms for the following week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, all of them interested based solely on my reputation and track record, all of them offering preliminary packages that made Morrison and Blake's offer look like an insult disguised as inevitability. The weekend passed in a strange calm. I cleaned my apartment with a kind of focused intensity that comes from needing to do something physical, something concrete. Scrubbed floors, organized closets, threw out years of accumulated possessions I'd been keeping out of inertia rather than affection. Went to the gym and ran until my legs burned and my lungs ached, and I couldn't think about anything except the next breath, the next step. Had dinner with my sister Angela, who'd been telling me for years that I worked too hard for people who didn't appreciate it, that I needed to value myself the way I valued my clients. I didn't tell her about the pay cut or the decision I was making. Some things you need to hold close until they're real, until you've acted on them and made them inevitable. Angela knew something was wrong. Sisters always know, but she didn't push, just poured more wine and talked about her kids and her husband and the ordinary problems of people whose careers didn't define them completely. Sunday night, I drafted my resignation letter, not the angry version I wanted to write, listing every betrayal and slight and moment when they'd taken my loyalty for granted, not the version that explained exactly how short-sighted they'd been, how they'd confused cost-cutting with strategy, how they'd optimized themselves into losing one of their top performers, the professional version, gracious, brief, effective immediately. Dear James and Patricia, I am writing to inform you of my resignation from Morrison and Blake, effective immediately. I appreciate the opportunities I've had here over the past 7 years and wish the firm continued success. I will ensure a smooth transition of my client accounts and am available to discuss next steps at your convenience. Sincerely, Sarah Chen. 71 words, 7 years reduced to a paragraph. But that's how these things work. You can spend years building something and leave it with less text than a text message, less ceremony than you'd give to closing a bank account. Monday morning, I dressed carefully. Navy Armani suit I'd bought to celebrate making senior account director 3 years ago, white silk blouse, Louboutin heels that made me 3 inches taller and cost a week's salary, armor disguised as business attire. I packed my personal items into a leather tote, photos of Angela's kids, awards from industry organizations, a plant that had somehow survived 7 years of my benign neglect, the small touches that had made my office feel like mine instead of just another corporate space. Everything else could stay. The Morrison and Blake branded notebooks, the client files that were technically company property, the accumulated paper trail of 7 years of work. I arrived at Morrison and Blake at 8 a.m., before most people, before the office filled with the morning rush of coffee and gossip and the performance of productivity. Went to my office, sent final status updates to my junior team members, 3 people I'd mentored who deserved to know I was leaving before they heard it through gossip. Organized my files so whoever took over my accounts would have what they needed. Downloaded my personal emails, my contact list, my calendar. Not client information, just the connective tissue of professional relationships I'd built over years. Professional to the end, even when the professionalism wasn't reciprocated. Even when I knew they'd have security escort me out the moment I resigned, that they'd revoke my building access and email within hours, that they'd treat my departure as a security threat rather than the loss of someone who'd made them millions. At 9:30, I walked into James Morrison's office without knocking. He was on the phone, held up a finger asking me to wait. I stood in the doorway until he finished, watching him through the glass that separated his corner office from the common areas. He looked comfortable, confident, like a man who'd never seriously considered that someone might say no to him, that power had limits, that authority required consent. "Sarah," he said when he hung up, checking his watch, that Patek Philippe that cost more than some people made in a year. "You're early. We weren't expecting your decision until 5 p.m. "I've made my decision," I said. I pulled out the envelope with my resignation letter, placed it on his desk with the deliberate care of someone handling something significant. "I'm declining the proposed compensation restructuring and resigning from Morrison and Blake, effective immediately." His expression shifted through several stages. Surprise, then confusion, then something harder. Calculation. The look of someone trying to determine if this was a negotiating tactic or an actual threat. "I don't think you've thought this through," he said, leaning back in his chair, recovering his composure. "In this economy, walking away from a stable position at a prestigious firm, I've thought it through very carefully," I said, and I was surprised by how calm I sounded, how steady. 7 years of thinking, actually. I'm grateful for the opportunities I've had here, but I can't accept compensation that doesn't reflect the value I bring. The market will determine what I'm worth, and I trust that more than I trust a restructuring designed to pad partner profits. I wish you and the firm continued success." I turned to leave. His voice stopped me before I reached the door. "What about Thornhill?" I looked back. "What about them? You can't take them with you. Your non-compete is very clear about soliciting clients. If you interfere with our client relationships, we'll pursue every legal remedy available." "I'm not soliciting anyone," I said, and I felt something settle in my chest, some last piece of doubt dissolving. But I also can't control whether clients choose to stay with a firm that just lost their primary point of contact. That's your challenge to manage, not mine. You might want to make sure whoever takes over my accounts understands the relationships, the history, what makes each client unique. Or you could treat them like expense lines to be optimized and see how that works out. His face reddened, that angry flush that powerful men get when someone refuses to be intimidated. "If you interfere with our client relationships in any way, we'll sue you for everything you have. The non-compete is enforceable, Sarah. We wrote it specifically to prevent situations like this." "Then I guess you should make sure your client relationships are strong enough to survive without me," I said, and I smiled, and it felt good. It felt powerful in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Good luck with the restructuring. I hope the cost savings are worth it." I walked out of his office through the common area where junior associates were just arriving with their coffee and their optimism and their belief that hard work mattered. Past the conference rooms where I'd pitched clients and won accounts and built the reputation that Morrison and Blake was now going to have to explain losing. Into the elevator that descended 42 floors back to street level, back to the city that didn't care about corporate drama or professional betrayals, or the small deaths of careers that hadn't turned out the way people planned. The morning was cold, bright, full of a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The kind of cold that makes you feel alive, instead of just awake. Spring was still fighting winter, but today, spring was winning. My phone rang before I reached the corner. Robert Thornhill. "Sarah, I just got a very strange call from James Morrison. He said you've resigned from Morrison and Blake." "That's correct." "Mind if I ask why?" I told him. "Not everything. Not the specific numbers or the details of the restructuring, but enough. The pay cut proposal. The devaluation after 7 years of performance. The realization that loyalty wasn't being reciprocated. That excellence didn't matter as much as I'd believed." He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. I could hear traffic on his end, the ambient noise of someone walking through a parking lot or a city street. "Where are you going?" he asked finally. "I'm taking meetings with a few firms this week. Nothing decided yet. I wanted to make sure I was making the move for the right reasons instead of just reacting emotionally." "Can I make a suggestion?" "Of course. Don't go to another big firm. They'll do the same thing eventually. You're too good, you'll make them too much money, and they'll decide they can squeeze you because where else would you go? They'll restructure or optimize or whatever word they use to make greed sound like strategy." He paused and I could hear him thinking, calculating. "Start your own consultancy. Independent. I'll be your first client. $18 million annually, 3-year contract. Same terms we had with Morrison and Blake, except you keep all the margin instead of giving them 30%. The street noise faded. Traffic, construction, sirens, the city symphony. All of it went distant, like someone had turned down the volume on everything except Robert Thornhill's voice. "Robert, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering. You built our relationship. You know our business better than anyone. You've delivered consistently for 7 years. I don't care about Morrison and Blake's brand. I care about your brain and your dedication, and your ability to make me look smart to my board. That's worth paying for directly instead of going through a firm that takes 30% off the top and clearly doesn't appreciate what they have." I stood on the corner of 5th Avenue and 43rd, people flowing around me like water around stone. Everyone with somewhere to be, something to do, roles to play in the city's endless production. And I felt something shift, not just in my circumstances, but in my understanding of what value meant, what it was worth, how it got recognized. Morrison and Blake had taught me that value was what they decided to pay me, what they chose to recognize, what fit their cost structure and profit requirements. Robert Thornhill was teaching me that value was what someone would actually pay for what you delivered, what the market would bear when you weren't filtered through corporate bureaucracy and partner profit-taking. "I need to think about it," I said, though I was already thinking about it, already calculating what it would take, what the risks were, what freedom might actually feel like. Starting a consultancy is a significant undertaking. Infrastructure, overhead, liability insurance, all the things a firm handles that I'd have to manage myself. "Take your time," Robert said. "But Sarah, whatever you decide, the Thornhill Industries is done with Morrison and Blake as of today. We'll honor our contractual obligations through the end of the quarter, but we're not renewing. I'm not working with a firm that treats their best people as cost centers to be optimized. That kind of thinking eventually shows up in how they treat clients too. We hung up, and I stood there on the corner, feeling spring sun on my face for the first time in months, feeling something like possibility opening up, where there had only been the narrow path of corporate advancement before. I called Marcus Webb back. "I need to know what's involved in starting my own consultancy," I said. "Realistically, not the inspirational version, the actual work." "Now we're talking," he said, and I could hear him grinning. "Let me make some calls. I know lawyers who specialize in business formation, accountants who handle consultant structures, insurance brokers who can get you coverage. And Sarah? Yeah? This is going to be the scariest thing you've ever done, but also the best. You ready for that?" I thought about James Morrison's face when I'd resigned, about Patricia Blake's portfolio with numbers that told me I was worth less, about David Chen's uncomfortable expression, like he'd known this was wrong but hadn't been willing to say it, about 7 years of loyalty that hadn't protected me when it mattered. "Yeah," I said, "I'm ready." The next 3 weeks were a controlled sprint through bureaucracy and business formation. I hired a lawyer, Rebecca Kim, someone Marcus recommended who specialized in professional services consulting. We met in a coffee shop in Midtown because I didn't have an office yet, didn't have anywhere professional to conduct business except my apartment. And that felt too vulnerable, too exposed. Rebecca was 45, sharp, the kind of person who asked good questions and listened carefully to the answers. She walked me through business formation options, sole proprietorship versus LLC versus S-Corp, each with different liability protections and tax implications. We settled on an LLC for the liability protection, S-Corp election for tax efficiency once revenue reached certain thresholds. I registered Chen Consulting Group with the New York Secretary of State on a Tuesday afternoon. The filing cost $200 and took 15 minutes online. 7 years of corporate infrastructure, 43 years of Morrison and Blake brand building reduced to an online form and a credit card payment. It should have felt anticlimactic. Instead, it felt like power. Like I'd claimed something that was always mine, but I'd been giving away to people who didn't value it appropriately. Business banking came next. I opened accounts at Chase, separated personal and business finances with the rigid discipline Rebecca insisted on. "The corporate veil only protects you if you maintain it," she explained. "Mix business and personal funds and you've pierced it yourself. Someone sues you, they can come after personal assets." Insurance was expensive and confusing. Professional liability, general liability, cyber liability for client data. I never thought about these things at Morrison and Blake. They handled it, and I just showed up and did the work and collected my salary. Now I was learning that salary was just the visible part of employment, that companies spent 40% more on benefits and infrastructure and protection I'd never had to consider. My apartment became my office, laptop on the dining table, printer on the kitchen counter, filing system in plastic bins because I couldn't afford real office furniture yet. Client files and contracts and business documents spread across every surface. It looked like chaos. It felt like building something. Robert Thornhill was true to his word. The contract arrived on day 4, delivered by his assistant with a handwritten note. "Looking forward to our continued partnership. Let's build something great together. $18 million annually. 3-year term, payment structure that covered my overhead and salary and left margin for growth. Net 30 payment terms, which meant I needed to figure out cash flow management for the first time in my career. I read the contract 3 times, checking every clause with Rebecca, making sure I understood what I was signing. It was real. 1 signature, and I'd have revenue that exceeded what I'd made at Morrison and Blake, without the politics or the partner profit sharing, or the constant pressure to bill more hours while accepting less compensation. But one client wasn't a business. It was dependency with better terms. I needed diversification, needed to prove this wasn't just Robert Thornhill doing a favor for someone he liked, needed to prove I could build something sustainable. I reached out to my other accounts from Morrison and Blake, not soliciting exactly, Rebecca was very clear about that, just informing them that I'd left and started my own consultancy and was available if they ever needed strategic marketing support. Professional courtesy. Former vendor notification. The kind of communication that walked the line between business development and non-compete violation. 3 of them responded within 24 hours. Catalina Tech, a software company I'd helped launch 2 years ago, taking them from unknown startup to recognized player in enterprise automation. We wondered when you'd leave Morrison and Blake. We've been unhappy with the transition. They assigned us to someone junior who doesn't understand our market. What would it cost to hire you directly? Pemberton Medical Devices, a healthcare manufacturer whose FDA regulatory marketing I'd navigated through 3 product launches. Morrison and Blake assigned us to a junior account manager. She's nice, but she's not you. She doesn't understand medical device marketing like you do. Are you taking clients? Verde Sustainability Group, an environmental consulting firm I'd helped rebrand from fringe player to mainstream business solution. We've been unhappy with Morrison and Blake for months, but we stayed because of you. Now that you're gone, we'd rather work with you directly. Can we talk about engagement terms? By the end of week 2, I had 5 clients committed. Thornhill, Catalina, Pemberton, Verde, and one more, a boutique hotel chain that had been considering Morrison and Blake but preferred my independent model. $32 million in projected annual revenue, more than I'd billed at Morrison and Blake. But now, the margin came to me instead of being split with partners who'd decided I was an optimization opportunity. The math was staggering. $32 million in revenue, 30% margin after my salary and overhead and the staff I'd need to hire. $9.6 million in profit that would have gone to Morrison and Blake partners. Now it would go to building my business, hiring talented people, creating the kind of firm that valued excellence instead of just extracting it. I needed help. Solo consultant might work for a year, but $32 million in revenue required infrastructure, support, people who could deliver the level of service clients expected. I started reaching out to former colleagues, people I'd worked with at Morrison and Blake who I knew were talented and undervalued. Lisa Park was my first hire, junior account manager at Morrison and Blake, someone I'd mentored for 2 years, teaching her everything I knew about client relationship management. She'd been laid off in the same restructuring that led to my pay cut, junior enough that they just eliminated her position entirely rather than bothering with a pay reduction. 28 years old, Columbia MBA, Korean-American woman who'd faced the same skepticism I had about whether she could compete with the old boys network. "Sarah," she said when I called, and I could hear the surprise in her voice. "I heard you left Morrison and Blake. I was going to reach out but didn't want to seem opportunistic." "How would you feel about being opportunistic?" I asked. "I'm starting my own consultancy. I have 5 clients committed, $32 million in revenue, and I need someone who can help me deliver. You interested?" Silence, then. "What's the catch?" "No catch, just hard work, long hours, building something from scratch, but also equity, profit sharing, and the knowledge that your compensation will reflect your contribution instead of being optimized by partners who don't know your name." "When do I start?" We met for coffee the next day. I laid out my vision: lean firm, talented people, fair compensation, the kind of place that valued excellence and rewarded it appropriately. Lisa listened with the intensity of someone who'd been unemployed for 6 weeks and was starting to panic about rent. "I'm in," she said. "When do I start?" "Monday. I need help building client onboarding processes, managing project workflows, and eventually taking on some of the day-to-day client management so I can focus on business development." We worked from my apartment initially, 2 women building a consulting firm on my dining table, competing with Morrison and Blake's 43 years of brand building and infrastructure. It should have felt impossible. Instead, it felt inevitable, like we were doing what we should have been doing all along instead of giving our talent to people who saw us as expenses to be optimized. Morrison and Blake noticed. They couldn't not notice. 5 major accounts leaving within a month of my departure wasn't coincidence, it was repudiation. James Morrison called 3 weeks after I'd resigned. "Sarah, I think we should talk." "About what?" "I may have been hasty about the compensation restructuring. The partners have been discussing your situation, and we'd like to make you an offer to return." I was in my apartment-turned-office, looking at my laptop screen filled with client strategy documents, Lisa working across the table from me with the focused intensity of someone who'd been given a second chance and wasn't going to waste it. The morning sun came through windows that I could actually see from, because I wasn't stuck in a corporate office designed to make you forget the outside world existed. "What kind of offer?" I asked, though I already knew I wasn't interested, though the conversation was just professional courtesy at this point. "Full restoration of your previous compensation, 20% increase on top of that, partner track discussion within the year, your old office back, your old accounts back, the ones that haven't already left, and the other senior managers who accepted the pay cuts." Silence, then. "We're addressing each situation individually based on performance and strategic importance," which meant no. meant I was special because I'd left and taken revenue with me, but everyone else who'd accepted the devaluation would stay devalued. The offer wasn't about recognizing my worth. It was about stopping the hemorrhaging of their client base, about demonstrating to remaining staff that leaving had consequences, but also that staying didn't protect you. I appreciate the offer, I said, but I'm happy with my current situation. Sarah, be realistic. You're running a consultancy out of your apartment with one employee. That's not sustainable long term. You need infrastructure, technology systems, support staff, legal and accounting resources, things a firm like Morrison & Blake provides that you can't replicate independently. I have clients, I have revenue, and I have control over my own career, I said. That's all the infrastructure I need right now. Everything else I can build or outsource. His tone shifted, became harder. The voice he used during difficult client negotiations, when he was trying to intimidate someone into submission. We could pursue legal action, your non-compete is enforceable, and you've clearly solicited our clients. That's a material breach that gives us standing to sue for damages. I informed former clients of my availability. They made independent business decisions about who they wanted to work with. If you think that's actionable, talk to your lawyers. But, James, I paused, let him hear the confidence in my voice. Ask them how it'll look in court when you have to explain why your top biller left after you cut her pay by 20%. Ask them how clients will testify about why they chose to leave Morrison & Blake. Ask them if you really want that story to become public, if you want potential recruits and clients to know how you treat your best people. He hung up without responding. Morrison & Blake didn't sue. They quietly reassigned my former accounts to other account directors. Watched 3 more leave over the following quarter, when clients decided they'd rather work with me directly and eventually stopped calling. I heard through the industry network, which is small and has excellent memory, that they'd lost nearly $40 million in annual billing within 6 months of my departure, that they'd had to make real cuts, not just restructuring that protected partners while squeezing everyone else. Junior partners laid off, office space reduced, expensive perks eliminated that had made their compensation structure feel justified. The market had corrected itself. They had treated top talent as a cost to be optimized, and the cost of that optimization was the talent leaving and taking their value, and their clients with them. Chen Consulting Group grew. By the end of year 1, I had 8 clients and $50 million in revenue. I hired 3 more account managers, all women who'd been undervalued at larger firms, all grateful for the opportunity to prove themselves without the politics. We leased proper office space in Midtown. Nothing fancy, but windows that opened and furniture we'd chosen ourselves and walls we could paint any color we wanted instead of corporate beige. Year 2, we hit $75 million. I hired a COO, Michael Torres, someone with 20 years of operations experience at agencies, someone who could handle infrastructure and technology and HR, while I focused on client strategy and business development. We established a profit-sharing structure where everyone's compensation was tied directly to the revenue they generated, transparently calculated and paid quarterly. No partners extracting margin while claiming scarcity. No restructuring that protected the top while squeezing everyone else. By year 3, we needed more space. The team had grown to 15 people, all of them talented, all of them committed to building something different from the extraction-based model most agencies operated on. We leased an entire floor in a building near Bryant Park, exposed brick, high ceilings, the kind of workspace that felt creative instead of corporate. Chen Consulting Group was real now, legitimate, more than just me and my reputation. I saw James Morrison once at an industry conference 3 years after I'd left. He was on a panel about agency sustainability and talent retention, talking about the importance of investing in people and building cultures where excellence could thrive. The irony was so thick I could have spread it on toast. During the Q&A, someone asked about compensation structures and whether traditional models needed to evolve. It's about creating a culture where people feel valued, James said, and his voice had that practiced sincerity of someone who'd learned to say the right things without meaning them. Where their contributions are recognized and rewarded appropriately. That's how you retain top talent in a competitive market. I didn't ask a question, didn't need to, but after the panel, he saw me in the hallway, stopped, looked like he was going to say something, congratulate me, maybe, or ask how the business was going, or pretend we were colleagues instead of what we actually were. Proof that talent flows to whoever values it appropriately. He didn't say anything, just nodded and kept walking. That was 3 years ago. Now Chen Consulting Group is at $90 million annually, 18 employees, all of them fairly compensated with market rate salaries plus equity stakes that mean they're building wealth along with the business. We turn down more work than we accept, because I refuse to grow faster than we can maintain quality, refuse to optimize ourselves into the same extraction model I'd escaped. Robert Thornhill is still my biggest client, still my biggest advocate, still the person who believed in me enough to take a chance on an apartment-based consultancy with no track record beyond one person's reputation. Last quarter, he told me that working with Chen Consulting Group instead of Morrison and Blake has saved his company money while delivering better results. That he recommends us to every CEO he knows. That the best business decision he made in the past 5 years was following the talent instead of the brand. Sometimes I think about that conference room on the 42nd floor, about the folder James Morrison slid across the table with numbers that told me I was worth less than I'd believed, that 7 years of loyalty and excellence didn't protect me from being optimized. About the moment when I realized that staying wasn't strength. It was accepting that I'd never be valued appropriately, that the system was designed to extract rather than reward, that loyalty only mattered if it was mutual. I think about the women I've hired, all of them escaping situations similar to mine. Talented, dedicated, loyal to firms that treated them as interchangeable resources instead of unique assets. About how many of them had been told they were difficult, or not team players, or too focused on compensation when they'd simply asked to be paid what they were worth, when they'd had the audacity to believe that excellence should be rewarded rather than just expected. I think about the business model we've built, lean, efficient, but generous with the people who generate the value. About how removing the extractive partner layer didn't make us less profitable, it made us more sustainable. About how treating people well wasn't charity or weakness or inefficient. It was strategy. The best strategy, actually, because talent performs better when it's valued, clients stay longer when they're served by people who aren't burned out. Growth is sustainable when it's built on something other than extraction and optimization. But mostly I think about that phone call with Robert Thornhill, standing on a corner in March with my career in a leather tote, and my future completely uncertain. About the moment when someone said, "Your value doesn't decrease just because they decide not to recognize it." That was the truth that changed everything. Morrison and Blake is still operating. They've recovered some of their losses, adapted their compensation model slightly, probably learned nothing from the experience except that they need to be more careful about who they undervalue and when. The partners are still making their margins, still driving their expensive cars, still wearing watches that cost more than their employees' annual bonuses. The system perpetuates itself because most people don't walk away. Most people accept the devaluation because security feels safer than uncertainty. I hope they're happy. I genuinely do. Because I've learned that success isn't making someone else lose. It's building something that reflects your values and rewards the people who help you build it. Morrison and Blake and I aren't competitors anymore. We're just two different philosophies about how to value talent, and the market will decide which one is sustainable. The city looks different from my office now. 20th floor in Midtown, east-facing windows, view of the water and the neighborhoods where I grew up, believing that hard work mattered and loyalty was reciprocated, and excellence was its own reward. I know better now. Excellence is only rewarded if you're willing to walk away when it's not. Loyalty only matters if it flows both ways. Hard work only pays off if you're working for someone, or yourself, who values it appropriately. They thought I wouldn't leave. Thought I needed them more than they needed me. Thought 7 years of devotion meant I'd bought in so completely that I'd accept whatever terms they offered. Thought that cutting my compensation by 20% was just efficient business management, that I'd be grateful to keep my job even in diminished form, that I'd understand it was just business and not personal. They were wrong. And their biggest client, along with 4 others who represented nearly $40 million in annual billing, walked out the door behind me. Not because I solicited them, not because I violated any non-compete or poached or engaged in the kind of behavior they threatened to sue me for, but because when you build real relationships based on mutual respect and consistent delivery and genuine care for your client's success, those relationships belong to you, not to the firm whose letterhead you used, not to the brand name on the building, not to the partners who collected the profit, to you. That's the part they never understood. They thought clients stayed with Morrison and Blake because of the firm's reputation, because of their prestigious address and their industry rankings and their carefully cultivated brand image built over 43 years. But clients stayed because of me, because of the weekend calls and the crisis management and the 7 years of attention that made them feel seen instead of serviced, understood instead of managed, partnered with instead of sold to. When I left, that relationship went with me. Not because I took it. I couldn't take what was never theirs to keep. The coffee in my cup has gone cold. It's late afternoon now, spring sun slanting through windows I can open whenever I want. Warming air I can breathe without feeling like I'm suffocating under fluorescent lights and corporate politics, and the constant pressure to prove my worth to people who'd already decided it was negotiable. Lisa is at her desk across the open office, working on a client presentation. Michael is in a meeting with our accountant, reviewing Q2 financials that continue to exceed projections. My phone shows 3 missed calls from potential clients who found us through referrals, who've heard that we're the team that left Morrison and Blake and built something better. I don't return the calls right away. Don't need to. Don't feel that desperate urgency to prove myself that defined my years at firms that treated excellence as expected rather than exceptional, that took loyalty and rewarded it with pay cuts and restructuring. Instead, I pour fresh coffee from the machine we bought for the office. Good coffee, the kind you actually want to drink, and open my laptop to work on strategy for Thornhill's Q4 campaign. The work I've always done, the work I'm good at, the work that matters. The difference is that now, when I deliver excellence, it's recognized, compensated appropriately, valued not as an expense to be optimized, but as an asset to be invested in. And if it ever stops being valued, I'll walk away again. Because that's the lesson they taught me when they slid that folder across the table and told me I was worth 20% less than yesterday, when they made it clear that 7 years of loyalty didn't protect me from being optimized, when they demonstrated that excellence only mattered if it was profitable enough for them. Your value doesn't decrease just because someone decides not to recognize it. Sometimes walking away is the only way to prove that. Sometimes building something better is the best revenge. Not because it hurts them, but because it proves you were right all along about what you were worth. The city lights are coming on now. Offices glowing across the skyline as people work late to meet deadlines for bosses who probably don't appreciate it, who see them as costs to be managed rather than assets to be invested in. I used to be one of them. Used to believe that staying late was virtue, that sacrifice was strategy, that making yourself indispensable meant you'd be valued, that loyalty would be reciprocated eventually, that excellence would be rewarded appropriately, that the system worked if you just worked hard enough within it. I know better now. Excellence is valuable. Loyalty is valuable. Dedication is valuable, but only if you're willing to take all of it somewhere else when the people you're giving it to decide you're just a line item on a spreadsheet. Just an optimization opportunity, just another cost to be reduced in service of someone else's profit margin. They learned that lesson when their biggest client walked out the door behind me, when 5 major accounts followed within a month, when $40 million in annual revenue disappeared, because they had decided I was worth 20% less than I had been. I learned it when I realized that the best response to being devalued isn't anger or litigation or making them understand what they lost. It's building something that proves your actual worth. Something that demonstrates what happens when talent is valued appropriately. Something that shows everyone watching that walking away is sometimes the most powerful choice you can make. The coffee is good now. The office is quiet in that productive way that means people are focused, engaged, building something together. The work is meaningful. The compensation is fair. The future is uncertain but full of possibility instead of the grinding inevitability of corporate advancement that requires you to diminish yourself incrementally until you're small enough to fit whatever role they've decided you deserve. And somewhere across the city, in a conference room on the 42nd floor, someone is probably sliding a folder across a table to someone who believes they're indispensable, who thinks 7 years of loyalty means something, who hasn't yet learned that the only thing that protects you is your willingness to walk away when you're not valued appropriately. I hope they walk away too, because loyalty is a two-way street, and some mirrors only show you what you've been too devoted to see clearly. Excellence deserves recognition, or it deserves to exist somewhere else, somewhere better, somewhere that understands that value flows to whoever recognizes it appropriately. Simple as that.